This guy named Eric Metaxas, dude on the left here, he wrote a book titled Letter to the American Church. It's a really short book, actually. Like, only, I don't know, if you're reading it like audiobook style, it's only like an hour or two long. I wanted to just kind of go through it a little bit and pick out all the absolute insanity in this book. Since it's so short, it won't take that long to burn through. And it's actually a really fascinating read to hear all the propaganda he lays down and everything. If you don't know Eric Metaxas, he is one of the voices on Veggie Tales, I believe. And he's got like an English degree, English literature or something. I don't remember what it is, but he's probably most famous for writing his book Bonhoeffer, where he lies about this guy, this World War II era pastor, for 400 pages. And I debunk a lot of the stuff that he lays down in my own book on the subject. Was Hitler an atheist? Amazon and Audible, if you're interested. Link in the description, of course. Anyway, yeah. I wanted to listen to his book, Letter to the American Church, because it is psychotic. Let's check it out. I used an app called ReadBit. It's a text-to-speech app that's flawless, in my opinion.
I have written this book because I am convinced the American church is at an impossibly and almost unbearably important inflection point. The parallels to where the German church was in the 1930s are unavoidable and grim. So the only question...
No. I'll explain why that's nonsense in a minute.
And what concerns us in this slim volume is whether we might understand those parallels and thereby avoid the fatal mistakes the German church made during that time. And
again, I wrote like a whole book on the German church in the 30s, and I can pull this apart pretty easily.
Superlatively catastrophic results. If we do not, I am convinced we will reap a whirlwind greater even than the one they did. The German church of the 1930s was silent in the face of evil. But can there be any question whether the American church of our own time is guilty of the same silence?
The German church in the 30s was not silent in the face of evil. That is complete garbage. The German church in the 30s was in favor of Hitler. They were excited for what he had to offer. Hitler was a nationalist, i.e., somebody who was very far right-wing and interested in all the same shit that like right-wingers are interested in today. He was worried about immigrants, talked about how immigrants were a problem that needed to be dealt with. The Jews were the immigrants of the era and of the region, in his mind at least, though they'd been there for hundreds of years. He talked about cultural decay, about how people were degenerate. There was moral degeneracy in society, and it needed to be dealt with. You know, gay people were freely getting married to each other, were living together at the very least. That's what Hitler's complaint was. And the church has always leaned far right in every society. That's just the nature of the church. They are very strict, hierarchical, top-down control, and they want gay people to like not be allowed to get married, and they don't want race mixing historically and all kinds of other things. So Hitler's style of nationalism was perfectly in line with what the church is looking for, which is why 15% were actively Nazis. They wanted openly what Hitler wanted, and they created a complete denomination called German Christians. They were going to call themselves Christian nationalists or Protestant nationalists because they excluded Catholics. But Hitler wanted German Christians instead of Christian nationalists, which was a name that was suggested. The other 10% of the church, 75% were intact, 15% German Christians, 10% were confessing church, which was opposed to Hitler's control over the church. However, they were also Nazis by and large. The leader of the confessing church, Martin Niemöller, was a Nazi. They just didn't want him interfering in their business is all. So this guy's just completely full of shit.
German church of the 1930s was silent in the face of evil. But can there be any question whether the American church of our own time is guilty of the same silence? Because of this, I am compelled to speak out and to say what, only by God's grace, I might say to make plain where we find ourselves at this moment, at our own unavoidably crucial crossroads in history. It is for good or for ill that America plays an inescapably central role in the world. If you have not read Alexis de Tocqueville on this subject, you likely nonetheless understand that the extent to which that central role has been used for good and for God's purposes has had everything to do with our churches, or with the American church, as we may call her. So, if America is in any way exceptional, it has nothing to do with the blood that runs through American veins, and everything to do with the blood shed for us on Calvary, and the extent to which we have acknowledged this.
That's interesting. So he is denouncing, I guess, white supremacy, I guess, or racial supremacy here. Okay, well, that's something. Most people on his side don't do that.
America has led the world in making religious liberty paramount, knowing that is only with a deep regard for it that we may speak of liberty at all. It was this that made Tocqueville marvel most, that while in other nations, and especially in his own nation of France, the church was adamantly opposed to the idea of political liberty, in America it was the churches that helped encourage, create, and sustain a culture of liberty. Because of the outsized...
The churches helped create a culture of liberty. No. The church, whenever society tries to make progress, there's the church standing in the way every single time. Every time.
Role America plays in the world today, the importance of whether we learn the lesson of what happened to the German church 90 years ago cannot be overstated.
But here's the problem. Absolutely. Except he learned the wrong lesson from the German church. He must know that he's full of shit. He must. Like, seriously, he wrote a 400-page book on this guy. He can't not know that he's lying here. He can't. So anyway, keep listening here.
Though it may be a gruesome thing to consider, the monstrous evil that befell the civilized world precisely because of the German church's failure is likely a mere foretaste of what will befall the world if the American church fails in a similar way at this hour. And at present we are indeed failing. We should underscore the idea that the centrality of our nation in the world does not mean that we are intrinsically exceptional, but rather that God has sovereignly chosen us to hold the torch of liberty for all the world, and that the church is central to our doing this.
So he says we are not uniquely, like, racially superior. We're just morally superior and spiritually superior. God chose us. All right. It's not that, like, our race was chosen by God. It's that our country was chosen by God. That's what I'm reading. So you can be any race you want and live in America, but you must be American if you want to claim to be chosen by God, right? I mean, that sounds like racism with extra steps.
So the idea that he has charged us with this most solemn duty should make us tremble. Nonetheless, we must carry out that duty in a way that is the opposite of prideful, and that is meant to be an invitation to all beyond our shores. If we should aspire, in the words of Jesus as quoted by John Winthrop, to be a shining city on a hill, the idea is that we should exist and shine for the sake of others and not for ourselves alone. President Abraham Lincoln said that we in America were God's almost chosen people, and acknowledged that this placed upon us an almost unbearable burden. It is a certainty from the scriptures and from our experience over the centuries that apart from God, we can do nothing. So if God has chosen us for some task, we must do all we can to shoulder that task, and must know more than anything that unless we lean on him and acknowledge him in all our ways, we are guaranteed to fail.
Yeah, he is totally leaning into this American supremacy thing.
We must also remind ourselves that when God chooses anyone, whether the nation of Israel or a single person, to perform any role or any task, it is never something to be celebrated as though the one chosen has won a contest. Quite to the contrary, it is a grave and fearsome responsibility. So if the Lord has chosen America and the American church to stand against the evils and deceptions of this present darkness, we had better be sure we understand what is required of us, and had better make sure we do all that is possible to fulfill our charge. Throughout this book, I will touch on some of the issues we are facing, but let us here say that it is something almost unprecedented, the emergence of ideas and forces that ultimately are at war with God himself. It's easy to see this with regard to Germany in the 1930s, when we think of the death camps and the murder of so many millions.
So he's saying that right now we're dealing with forces that are oppositional to God. And he says it's easy to see that regarding, like, Germany in the 30s, but we need to understand that in the beginning, the Germans had no idea where it was leading, and they were facing nothing less than the forces of Antichrist. Okay, you know what? I'm not going to bother. Just let him keep going. I just finished writing a book titled Was Hitler an Atheist? It talks about religions during the Third Reich and how they worked together. Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Protestants. And I even address the lies told by the evangelical world about Bonhoeffer. It's on Audible and Amazon. Okay, let's continue.
We need to understand that in the beginning, they had no idea where it was leading, and had no idea they were facing nothing less than the forces of Antichrist. We are now facing those same forces in different guises. But the extent of it is even worse than it was 90 years ago, because those forces do not have an agenda that is hyper-nationalistic, as in...
Okay, now wait a minute. He says it's worse today than it was in Germany because is he saying that today the forces don't have an agenda that's hyper-nationalistic? Like Germany had one that was hyper-nationalistic, but it's anti-nationalistic, which is say that it's globalist. Wow, that's fascinating. So let me lay this down. He's saying he recognized that he is on the side that is being fought with the Nazis. He is implicitly admitting that he knows that he's fighting with Nazis. But it goes right over his head, seemingly?
Germany, but that is actually anti-nationalistic, which is to say that it is globalist. These ideas seem to have emerged lately, but they have been growing quietly in our midst, and we have not taken them seriously enough. Many have been fooled into thinking them essentially harmless.
So he's saying globalism is out to get us, What the hell does he even mean by globalism, by the way? Like, there's nothing wrong with bringing immigrants into the country. In fact, it's good for an economy. Phenomenally good. I don't understand why he's complaining about immigration. I don't know what else he could be talking about when he says globalism. Is that what that means? Spoiler alert, he doesn't really go into much detail about it in the book. He doesn't really expound upon it, satisfactorily to me at least.
We are today like the proverbial frog in the saucepan, simmering along and never realizing that unless we see our situation and leap out now, we are very soon to be cooked and beyond all leaping. The ideas and forces we face have an atheistic Marxist ideology in common, although it never declares itself as such. It
Okay, interesting.
knows that doing this would wake many people up who are still asleep, and that would ruin everything. But what we must dare to see is that these many ideas share a bitter taproot that leads all the way down to hell. Critical race theory, which is atheistic and Marxist, and radical transgender and pro-abortion ideologies are all inescapably anti-God and anti-human.
Oh my God, dude. You know what critical race theory is? I feel like it's been a while since people talked about this, so I'm just going to like mention it again. Critical race theory, critical theory is something that's taught in law schools. You should be critical of ideologies and approach it from a critical lens because we live in an adversarial system where one person has to advocate to the death for one side and the other has to advocate to the death for the other side. So a prosecutor is advocating against or just fighting vehemently the one that they're prosecuting, and the defense lawyer is defending them no matter what. Doesn't matter what they did or why or how or whatever. His job is to prevent the prosecutor from succeeding in what they're doing. That's the way our system works. It's an adversarial system. It's the best we've got. And the truth is hopefully somewhere in the middle, or hopefully justice is in the middle. So critical theory is teaching people to think from through a lens like that. It is looking at a situation in the most extreme sense. It's looking at race through an absolutely insane perspective. Like, it's looking at it from an insane perspective, an unreasonably insane perspective, because it's valuable in an adversarial system to understand that thought process. So they teach critical theory of all different sorts in law school. One of the critical theories they teach in law school is critical race theory. There's critical feminist theory and, a billion others. It's just the way our system works. There isn't some big, secret, some cabal trying to teach kids this or whatever. This stuff is not taught to children. Anyway, just absurd. And all of this, Marxist, racial, transgender, and pro-abortion ideologies, this shit is all in his head. Okay? None of this stuff is happening. None of this stuff is a problem or whatever. My God.
So they are dedicatedly at war with the ideas of family and marriage and with the idea of America as a force for good, as a force for spreading the gospel and gospel values throughout the world.
Oh, I remember where I'm going now. God, I couldn't remember for the life of me where I was supposed to go next. I remember now.
These ideas have over many decades infiltrated our own culture in such a way that they touch everything, and part of what makes them so wicked is that they smilingly pretend to share the biblical values that champion the underdog against the oppressor.
So he's saying that, there are people on the left that are Christian, but he says that basically that you can't be on the left if you are a Christian? I'm sorry, yeah. Is that what he's saying? I think it is.
As Stalin and Hitler and Mao would butcher millions in the name of fighting for the people. So these forces do the same, and are angling to do much, much more of the same if we will.
See, this is like gaslighting to the most extreme degree. This is literally what the far right is doing. They are pretending to be Christian when they are actually neo-Nazis, effectively. They have adopted the neo-Nazi perspective on the world, that there should be racial purity, and that the black community is absolutely worthless and they're messing everything up and they just need to get it together and all this other stuff. This is all coming from the far right, which is the ideology to which he subscribes. It's just going right over his head, I guess. Does he really not realize that he is the Nazi in this scenario?
In the name of fighting for the people. So these forces do the same, and are angling to do much, much more of the same if we will allow them the time to strengthen themselves, if we do not fight with all our might and main against them right now. One of the principal ways in which they have gained strength is in persuading so many in the American church that to fight them is to abandon the gospel for pure culture, warring, or for politics.
The interesting thing about Germany in the 30s is that culture wars were a problem. Like when Hitler finally ended up taking control in the last election before he took control, actually, the election that he ran against Paul von Hindenburg, it was all culture war stuff. There was no policy in there anywhere. Like the Nazis released a policy document, a 25-point policy document when they first kind of entered politics. And that's the last time they offered policy. All the rest of it was culture war nonsense. Like we see today, honestly. Like anti-trans rhetoric, anti-gay, anti-immigrant, it's all culture war shit. The degradation of society, the decay of society, moral degeneracy. Yeah, moral degeneracy. I mean, it's all the same shit that Hitler was saying back then.
This is not just nonsense, but is a supremely deceptive and satanic lie designed only to silence those who would genuinely speak for truth. So those who behave as though there is really nothing to worry about, who seem to think, as such prominent pastors as Andy Stanley and others do, that we ought to assiduously avoid fighting these threats and be apolitical.
No, nobody's saying that exactly. They're saying you're fighting demons, for one thing. They're not there. It's pretend. I probably shouldn't say fighting demons because that kind of confuses the situation. The problems you're presenting aren't real. It's all culture war shit, the same as it was in Germany in the 1930s. All culture war nonsense that's fictitious. Pastors that are not on the far right, that aren't complete nutcases, aren't necessarily saying be apolitical. They're saying, for one thing, it's not there, and for another thing, Jesus would have supported people anyway. He said, what you've done to the least of my brothers, you've done to me. For example, Ken Paxton. Wait, you think Jesus would approve of Ken Paxton, Attorney General of Texas, suing a Christian ministry that helps the homeless? You think this is, what you would expect to see in a government run by Christians? No. This is the result of the far right pretending to be Christian. I mean, they may believe it. They may actually think that what they're doing is, they may actually think that what they're doing will get them closer to God. I don't know. Christian is a self-ascribed label. So if they're Christian, if they say they're Christian, period. But they're completely contradicting what Jesus said. That's all. So, pastors are not saying we need to be apolitical. They're saying that is literally not what Jesus wanted. You're doing the exact opposite.
Are tragically mistaken, are burying their heads in the sand and exhorting others to do the same. Or to put it another way, they are in their churches singing more and more loudly to drown out the cries of those in the boxcars heading to their gruesome deaths.
This is a quote from somebody who claims, that this situation happened. I have no reason to doubt it, I guess, but the person said that he was in church and one of the boxcars broke down and the Jews inside, got out and they were running, trying to escape. And they were screaming as the guards were, pulling the trigger and taking them out, And the church leader couldn't do anything. What could he have possibly done? The whole church is disturbed by it, listening to people screaming and crying outside, And the guy basically just said, sing louder, unless you want to go outside and be shot by the guards as well. Anyway, like I said, that was a claim. I'm not sure if that's real, but yeah, that's probably what he's talking about.
Sing with us, they say, and don't worry about all of those other issues out there. They don't concern us. Our
That's not what anybody is saying.
job is to focus on God and to pretend that we can do so without fighting for those he loves, whose lives and futures are being destroyed.
No, I'm not saying that. As somebody who wants a secular state, I'm saying as a member of society, every person in that church should be involved in politics. Every single one of them should be down there voting on voting day and chatting with each other about political issues and everything. That's what a healthy democracy does. What I have a problem with is these churches using their authority to influence elections and influence bills that are passed and everything else. That's the problem. Individuals should be involved. Institutions should not use their authority to take advantage of the whole situation. That's the issue here.
So to restate our situation, this is not a task or duty we in the American church have asked for. Nonetheless, just as the German church had a painfully important task and did not rise to that occasion to perform it, so we have a painfully important task, whether we have asked for it or not. God calls us to do something, but the choice whether we do it is entirely ours. Because we are made in God's image, we are perfectly free, and therefore cannot be compelled to do what is right. It is a chilling prospect, especially in light of the failure of the German church. If anyone would feel that believing God has chosen the American church for such a vital role somehow smacks of an egotistical nationalism, they have already bought into the Marxist and globalist lie that America is nothing special.
Wow, that America is nothing special. If anyone would feel that believing in God has chosen the American church for such a vital role somehow smacks of an egotistical nationalism, that's what it's nationalism. Yes. Nationalism is the belief that you or your group specifically uniquely has a right to rule that other groups don't have for whatever reason. Um, Germany was full of I guess you could call them white nationalists, but Jews were white at the time too. Like they had to use people's papers to prove that Jews were like not that they didn't belong in Germany or whatever else. You couldn't just like look at somebody and immediately identify it. But I guess you could say it's white supremacy that Germany was dealing with. White nationalists in the KKK believe that white people uniquely have a right to rule. It doesn't necessarily have to be a right to rule that was ordained by God. It can just be because you believe that you're superior, like black people, just like genetically inferior to white people, for example. But the point is that nationalism is a belief that you uniquely should rule, and the other group that opposes you should not. So anyway, that's what nationalism is. And he's saying that if you feel that way, it's not nationalism. It's just loving Jesus or believing God or something. Like, I don't understand. You literally define nationalism and say this is not nationalism. That's different from patriotism in that patriots love their country and would fight for their country and everybody in it. Want to help everybody and provide for them and willing to like give up their lives to help others, to help everybody. That's a patriot. You want to see your country succeed. Nationalism is you want to see your group succeed politically.
Or is probably a force for evil at this point. In any case, they miss the point and have only leapt away from one ditch to fall headlong into another. It is a fact that God in his sovereignty chose the German church to stand against the evils of its day, but it shrank from acknowledging this and from standing. Germany has been living with the deep shame over it unto this day. So for the American church to say that God has not chosen us is as bad as saying he must choose us because we deserve to be chosen.
I mean, this is literally exactly what Germans said. Exactly what Germans said. We were chosen to rule. Others are not chosen to rule. They're not allowed to rule. They're not supposed to rule. We uniquely have the right to.
Both stances are equally guilty of the sin of pride. It is far easier to ignore God's call than to acknowledge it and rise to fulfill it, but it is more difficult and painful than anything to live with the results of ignoring God's call. Let the reader understand. Chapter 1. What is the church? See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess.
So he's talking about Israel, right? He's talking about when they took Israel, the Jews, in the Old Testament, and God would only let certain people in or whatever. I'm not really sure what this has to do with the U.S. today. The God of the Old Testament was definitely very, very different from the one of the New Testament. So
call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Deuteronomy 30:15-20. Before we explore the parallels of our situation and choices to those of the German church in the 1930s, we must briefly touch upon the American church of our own time. In doing so, we cannot go very far without raising the most fundamental question. What is the church? The Christian martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer asked and answered that question in his brilliant doctoral dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, written when he was only 21 years old.
Oh, God. The Bonhoeffer worship drives me nuts, honestly. Like, he's only famous because he opposed what the Nazis were doing on moral grounds rather than on technical grounds. Well, we don't want him involved in the church, Hitler that is. So we're going to oppose Hitler because he's trying to push his way into the church and control things. But we still believe in the anti-Jewish stuff that he preaches. That is what most pastors were saying and doing. But Bonhoeffer was just disturbed by the anti-Jewish rhetoric on on moral grounds alone. That's why he's special. He's one of like 3 or something. Now, it's more like 20 out of 18,000 actually opposed this stuff on moral grounds. So, anyway, the sermons that he put out aren't that special or incredible. They're pretty normal, actually. I can get those sermons from any random person, down the block. It's just normal theological thinking. I don't see why Eric Metaxas is so obsessed with him, outside of the fact that he can use him to further his own agenda.
But much more importantly, he continued to ask and answer that question with his very life, until his untimely death 18 years later at the hands of the Nazi regime. The question was not and could not only be academic or theological or intellectual. In some ways, it is the most fundamental question in human existence. If the God of the Bible is real, if he created the universe and created us and sent his son to die and rise again so that we might have a relationship with him now and for all eternity, there cannot possibly be any more important question. What does it mean for those of us who would say we are Christians to be Christians? What exactly is the church, which God tells us is his bride? Some might say the church is a movement or an institution, but that is hardly God's idea about what the church is or is supposed to be. The real question is more pointed. When is the church actually being the church of Jesus Christ instead of being that in name only? In the Old Testament, God sent prophets to call the people of God actually to be the people of God, not only in name, but in how they lived. And in the last
I have no idea what he's talking about.
2,000 years, God has sent prophetic figures to do the same thing. To call the people of God, what we now know as the church, actually to be the church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of those voices. He called the German church actually to be the church in their time. And as I hope to make clear, his voice to them is his voice to us today.
Bonhoeffer was actually calling for people to... He's actually calling for people to separate church and state. That's what he's trying to do. That's what the confessing church is trying to do. Separate church and state, because Hitler was forcing the two together by forcing them to swear an oath of allegiance to him and melding his melding his ideology about Jews with theology. So Eric Metaxas claiming that Hitler is trying to get, that Hitler was trying to get politics and religion be separate? Not really. I guess it kind of depends on what you're talking about specifically. But no, not really.
American church to actually be God's church, with all that entails, so that we might avoid the mistakes of the German church in the 1930s and those direct consequences we know to have been their result. But let's face it, what God usually asks of his people is that they actually live out their faith in all the spheres of their lives so that all of society is blessed. And when they fail to do this, they are failing to be the church. So when we ask what the church is today, and consider the condition of the church today, we should first admit that in latter decades it has receded more and more from public life. In many ways, instead of taking the church out into the world and blessing the world, it has shrunk backward into what it mistakenly thinks of as a proper religious sphere.
No, the church as an institution in the United States today is more integrated and involved in everything than I think maybe it's ever been in U.S. history. I would argue I would argue that the connection between church and state is way more intense today.
It seems to be its misguided way of apologizing for perhaps having been too political in the 1980s and 1990s, when the moral majority and religious right were the bogeyman of the secular media, who always accused Christians of being too political, as they do today when...
I don't have a problem with Christians being political. I have a problem with Eric Metaxas using his position as a religious figure that leads a religious institution, using that institution to meddle in U.S. elections. Eric should be involved in politics. He should have a say in this. He should have an opinion.
Anything we might say nettles their own uncompromising secular doctrines.
Dude, did you hear this AI just say That is crazy how realistic it sounds. One more time.
Do today when anything we might say nettles their own uncompromising secular doctrines.
I'm telling you, man, this AI is flawless. Crazy.
But many in the churches were not up to these criticisms, and weary of the contentious culture wars, they thought that yes, perhaps it was time to retreat to strictly theological and religious issues. Perhaps it was time merely to preach the gospel, as though such a thing were logically possible.
Dude, I love that he's saying churches thought they should retreat to just theological issues. Are you kidding me? Isn't that literally the church's job? Theological examination, analyzing theological issues?
The gospel ever could be kept from touching upon all of the issues of human life, or as though that would be anything but an abdication of God's calling. The sociologist James Davison Hunter became for many the voice of this approach, which, in his 2010 book To Change the World, he referred to as faithful presence. For many, this came to mean that we in the church ought not to be too bold about what we believe and proclaim. Perhaps it would just be wiser to keep a bit quiet and to be Christians in a way that was not very actively engaged with the world around us, but that might have an effect over the long term.
No, you should be involved. You should be engaged as a Christian, or as just as a citizen, not as a Christian. You should be engaged as a citizen. And if your Christian faith influences the way that you see the world, okay. You know, Raphael Warnock is, I think, the pastor at Martin Luther King Jr.'s old church, maybe? And he's also a senator, and I'm totally fine with that. I don't care. Great, yeah, let him do that. Fine. But if he came in and started trying to impose religious rules on people, then I'd have a problem with it.
But the God who himself is truth cannot under any circumstances be chased into some arbitrary religious corner, as though the church's witness in the public square is somehow inherently untoward and overly aggressive. Nor can Christians be forced to express their faith only on Sunday mornings and only in certain buildings. Those
Like, no one's trying to stop you from expressing your opinion or your faith.
who purport to call him Lord can never allow themselves to go along with whatever such contorted theological calisthenics would involve. Such a view is at its core simply secular and constitutes a fundamental misunderstanding of who God is. Nonetheless, many Christians, often for understandable if mistaken reasons, have gone along with this, somehow thinking it to be the best way forward. The first thing to be said about this, to the extent anyone has gone along with such views, is that we hope they might see their error and repent. It is in brutal, atheistic regimes like China, where such attitudes can be seen to prevail in all of their horror, where the state insists upon such a view and has the power to enforce it, essentially saying, you may do as you like in that building at such and such hours, but when you come out, you must bow to the secular authority of the state. In America, we have usually
Okay, I don't remember China saying that. I think China just banned religion outright, didn't it?
understood things dramatically differently. We have known that religious liberty means we are not merely able to worship privately and to keep our religion to ourselves, but are guaranteed a free exercise thereof, so that our faith must by definition be carried everywhere we go, on every day of the week, and in every place we take ourselves. Many have died for these freedoms, so the mistaken idea that we should voluntarily give them up is unprecedented.
Okay, I'm not telling him to give up his religious beliefs.
Deeply
I'm sorry, to give up his religious beliefs. I'm not even telling him to, not let it influence his political opinions or whatever. Just don't use the institution to further your personal political goals. And don't try to co-opt the state. Don't take control of the state to force your religious beliefs on others. That's really one of the biggest problems. Christian nationalists trying to force others or force their religious beliefs on others, like being anti-porn, anti-abortion. That's all. It's all based on religious reasoning. I don't want to practice your religion. You go nuts.
un-American and cannot be allowed to continue. It constitutes a violation of the most central idea of what makes America America. But where did we ever get the idea that we should mind our own business along such lines, as though the truth of God were a parochial, subjective idea that had no bearing on anything beyond our private prayer times and churches?
Nobody said that.
Where did we, who claim to be the church, ever get the idea that we shouldn't express any number of things too loudly, that we shouldn't, for example, express the biblical view of human sexuality as a sacred and mysterious bond which God created only for the marriage between men and women for life?
Nobody said that. You want to be anti-gay? Go ahead, go be anti-gay, but I'm going to recognize you as the shithead that you are, that's all. Well, you want me to not believe that you're a shithead for espousing these beliefs that one group of people is inferior to another based on some intrinsic quality about them? Sorry, bro, I'm going to think you're a shithead. And you cannot bring this shit into the political realm by forcing your religious beliefs on me by political means. You just cannot do that. Or you shouldn't be allowed to anyway. That's what he's trying to do. Again, I don't care if you have opinions. Have them till you're blue in the face. I care that you're forcing them on me.
Where did we get the idea that we don't have an obligation to tell the world what God says about such things, about the unborn, and about human freedom and human rights? Or about anything, including the deadly perniciousness of Marxist atheist philosophy, whether in economics or in any other sphere?
What does that have to do with religion? I don't understand what he's talking about.
Where did we get the idea that we shouldn't be at the forefront in criticizing the great evil of communist countries like China that brutally persecute religious minorities in ways that bring to mind the Nazis themselves?
Bro, nobody said that.
And why would we not speak out against American and international corporations that do business with them until they force them to take human rights seriously and change their inhuman practices?
What's he saying? We shouldn't work with China. We shouldn't do business with China at all until they give up communism. Is that what he's saying? I think so. Yeah, that's what he's saying. China is not really, really evil and heinous, like to the degree that the Nazis were. They're just not. Religion is banned in China, to my knowledge, currently, and that's a problem. I don't like that. But they're not like murdering people en masse right now, the way that Germany did it. Certainly not like that. I mean, they do have camps that are disturbing to me, China does. But he's not talking about any of that. He's complaining that in his mind, China is like oppressing and murdering Christians the way that like Germany did to Jews. And we shouldn't deal with China until that stops.
How dare we be silent about such things? We must remember that William Wilberforce in his day was told to keep his faith private, and was told that his religious
Who the fuck is William Wilberforce? Who told him to keep his faith private? Who is William Wilberforce? He's a British politician, philanthropist, and a leader of the movement to abolish the slave trade. Okay. Did somebody tell him to keep quiet? I don't know what you're talking about here.
that slavery was wrong had no business poking out into the wide world. It was thought an absolute scandal that a man would bring his religion into the public sphere and dare to impose his views through the laws of the land.
I mean, your beliefs form out who you are, and as a citizen, you should be involved in politics. But you can't impose your religious beliefs on others. That's not what was happening. I don't know what reason he had for opposing slavery. Maybe it was religious, who knows? But slavery was wrong. So I don't say slavery is wrong for religious reasons. I say it's wrong for human rights reasons.
But Wilberforce knew that his religious views about slavery were only religious to those who didn't like them, many of whom were making monstrous profits from the evil of the transatlantic slave trade. So we thank God that he did not let those naysayers dissuade him one bit, and kept at his campaign to end slavery, having no doubt that it was God's will for him to do so.
You know, a lot of people come up with reasons to support this cause or that, and claim that their reasoning is from the Bible, but it's not really. They look through the Bible and find some justification for whatever it is they want. Being anti-gay has just as much validity as being pro-slavery. It's spoken about in roughly the same area in the Bible, and it's not really endorsed in the same way in the New Testament, for example. Like, how can he justify what he said earlier, not wanting gay people to get married, while simultaneously opposing slavery? The reason that happens is because he's selectively picking which parts of the Bible he wants to believe or follow or read or like. And he's leaving the parts out that he doesn't like.
He also had no doubt that it was the duty of everyone who dared identify as a member of the church in England to join him in this, and to that extent was a prophetic voice to the church of his time. But where are those voices in the American church today regarding the inhuman cruelties perpetrated by the Chinese communists on the Uyghur Muslims and so many others? Of course, Dietrich Bonhoeffer too was told not to be political. His Christian faith gave him...
He was told not to be political? What are you talking about? No, he wasn't. When was Dietrich Bonhoeffer told not to be political? This did not happen.
His Christian faith gave him the idea that because German Jews were being wickedly persecuted, he had an obligation to speak out, and not only to speak out but to do everything he could, unto the point of surrendering his own life, for what he knew to be right.
Well, I don't think it was his Christian view. I think that it was probably, at least in part, because he had family members that were non-Aryan, so it affected him personally, and he recognized like how important it is to value human rights. But maybe, who knows?
He understood that what is right and true is never merely right and true for some, but is inevitably right and true for all, or is not right and true at all.
Look, I don't understand that statement. I hear this shit from people all the time. Listen one more time to this sentence here, right here.
He understood that what is right and true is never merely right and true for some, but is inevitably right and true for all, or is not right and true at all.
What does that mean? I don't know. I don't understand. I hear that a lot from anti-trans influencers or whatever. I hear it all the time from people who are trying to take a shot at trans people. If a man can become a woman, then that's true for everybody. And if it's not true for everybody, then it's not true for anybody. What? That's not how logic works. And also, are you saying that if somebody feels that they are, or if somebody accepts or realizes that they're trans, then everybody realizes that simultaneously? What are you even talking about right now? What does that mean? Fascinating. Well, let me know what you think about this in the comments, and let me know if you want to finish this book. Again, it's not very long. It's only like 3 chapters or something total, so I think maybe 4. So I think we can probably cover this in just like a couple more episodes. Yeah. Tell me what you think.